Hello, everyone. I'm CJ Laguerre with Lean Startup Company, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the webcast. Today's topic is Lean Startup in Filmmaking, and moderating is our very own Lean Startup Company faculty member, Marilyn Gorman. Our guest is founder and CEO of Guerrilla Rep Media, Ben Yennie. And with that, I'll hand things off to Marilyn.
Thanks so much, CJ. And Ben, thank you for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to an interesting conversation. I'm sure you've seen the notes as well when CJ was kind enough to pull all this together. And in our notes, she said, well, who is this webcast aimed at? And she had the Lean Startup community and independent filmmakers and broke filmmakers. And I thought, well, yeah, I think that's kind of the magic bullet. But the reality is, of course, anybody who's working in your field of work wants to create films that people want to see. So maybe we could start by just talking about the current landscape in the film industry as you see it and what you're experiencing.
No problem. I actually worked on a report with the help of a couple of other industry partners that meant to clarify exactly what the landscape is, because it's not as well defined as we would hope it is. But the biggest landscape is one of turmoil and upheaval, which is a great chance for disruption, but it's also one that's very difficult to make a career in if you try to work in the practiced methods. And since we're talking about broke filmmakers and independent filmmakers, the sad fact of the matter is most independent filmmakers are broke. The average income from filmmaking is around $15,000 a year, but the average household income of filmmakers is around $60,000, which is well above the national average. But that basically means that most filmmakers don't actually make their money from practicing their craft. They make it from a day job, or they make it from a partner or family member.
Sure. And
that is probably the short answer to your question.
Well, it seems that would also map pretty well, unfortunately, against the statistic I've heard in the past that, the reality is 70%, 75% of all startups fail in any case. So if we look at the number of potential filmmakers out there, it certainly is not unrealistic to expect so many of them are struggling. But I like the disruption that you talked about earlier, this uncertainty that Lean Startup can often help with uncertainty. So if we think about Lean Startup primarily as being applicable to the technology world, how do you see it being applied to the film industry? What is it that filmmakers need to do in terms of adopting a different mindset, even, let alone using the tools that could be helpful for them?
Well, there are several things that filmmakers can do to adapt the Lean Startup to the industry. It doesn't go one for one. I've looked into it a lot, but you can learn a lot from the principles of the Lean Startup and modify them only slightly to really grow your chances of being successful in film. One of the biggest ones is, I think, the first principle of the Lean Startup is that entrepreneurs are everywhere. And when I'm talking about this, the biggest thing I say is that filmmakers are entrepreneurs themselves, because a lot of filmmakers think of themselves more as artists than as business people or entrepreneurs. And if you actually adjust that mindset, that alone greatly increases your chances of success. And there's a couple of other things. The biggest difference between a tech startup and filmmaking is that while filmmaking is uncertain, it's not uncertain to the same degree that a tech startup's uncertain. You're mainly working within a framework of you're not developing a new technology. You're not creating something from nothing. You're working based on about 80 to 100 years of precedent and iterating on that previous precedent. So there's more to go from when you're talking about making a film than there is when you're talking about making a tech startup. And but the biggest thing that's uncertain is how you're going to find your target market and how you're going to market your product. So a lot of what I talk about and utilize the lean startup for when it comes to filmmaking is building the brand of the production company and helping build community around the films and the filmmaker. And that's a lot of it. It focuses more on the business and marketing side than necessarily the product side, because it's very difficult to iterate on a film, especially when you compare it to a tech company. But there are places you can iterate. Like, you should consider, when you think your film is picture locked, you have a minimum viable product. You don't have a completed product.
Sure.
And you should do test screenings to iterate on your minimum viable product to get it so that it's actually ready for market.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting in that you talked about the many, many years of precedents that filmmakers have that they can rely on or leverage. One of the things that commercial organizations or enterprises struggle with, especially if they have a legacy organization with 75, 100 years of history, is how they shift the culture to be able to adopt something new, to adopt a new way of working. Because that old saying, what got us here won't get us there, can still be true. So for all of that legacy that the film industry has, how does this culture shift actually translate to things like production houses or working on a set? How are people demonstrating entrepreneurial behaviors in those situations?
That's a very good question. And the biggest thing to keep in mind is that while we have 80 years of precedent, it's not something that we can exactly rely upon. It's something that we can learn from and learn what's worked in the past to estimate what might work in the future. And there's more of an established business practice, although that's the biggest thing that's being upheaved right now. So every film needs to be an iteration on something new, and it needs to be a completely new product, despite the fact that it will have been influenced by products before it. And if you don't innovate when you're making your film, you're not going to be able to break out from the massive glut of content that's being produced. That's probably the biggest threat to filmmakers right now, is the huge glut that makes discovery very, very difficult. And that's one where approaching with something of a hybrid model between the old ways of sales agent oriented distribution and more producer self-distribution and marketing. If you can find some sort of a hybrid between the two, then you're going to have a much better chance of breaking out for your first film. Whereas if you don't and the only other option besides that is to develop a massive community around yourself and your work, and develop your voice and your brand image as a filmmaker, so that you actually have some way of accessing your target market. And the community aspects of it are also things that can be useful for getting beta viewers and things like that, calling back to what I was mentioning about your picture lock cut not being your final cut, not actually being your picture locked cut. So what kind of metrics
do entrepreneurial filmmakers use? I'm sure well, I'm not sure, but I suspect, like traditional, again, enterprises, the finance team want to know, what is our return on investment going to be? How can we be sure that what we're investing in will be successful? And of course, again, in an enterprise situation, we talk about leading indicators, behavioral indicators. So how do entrepreneurial filmmakers adopt a different set of metrics?
So most of the way that revenue is projected for film investment now is that you do a comparative analysis, which is taking 20 films from the last 5 years of a similar genre and similar themes and putting them in and taking their box office numbers out, and then finding what you can about the home video numbers on them and running them through to get an estimate of what the ROI for each of those was, and then creating an average ROI and projecting your ROI will be that plus or minus a margin of error that depends on who you're talking to. But the problem with that is you're projecting public opinion 2 years out based on data from 5 years before. So it's not necessarily the most reliable thing, but it's one of the most reliable metrics that is used right now. The other way to do it is to get sales estimates from a sales agent, because they're the people who will actually be going out and selling the film, and they'll do a similar sort of estimate based on their experience from the last year or two in selling to each territory internationally. And the problem with that one is you have to have a relationship with the sales agent to get it. You can't. It's not just something anybody can walk up and get. You actually have to have you have to have talked to the sales agent and developed some level of relationship. Now, those are the only two things you can do at the investment stage. And but the biggest thing to think about when you're thinking about film investment, and I know this is a little off topic, but it's not something that's directly applicable to startups, is that you shouldn't be looking at equity only when you're looking at film investment. There's about 9 different ways to finance a film. You can be going from tax incentives, you can be looking at product placement, pre-sales if you have the right assets. You can also be looking at some level of grants and some other ways of backed and unbacked debt as opposed to equity, which helps flesh out your financial mix, which really helps cut the risk to investors. And if you're looking at it solely as an equity play, it's a really bad investment. Most films don't make money. And tech, despite its uncertainties, the upside is so huge that it's a much safer investment. It's also a much better defined asset class. So looking at film investment, you have to look at soft incentives as well as the actual ROI. You have to look at things like the tax benefits depending on what state you're investing in, as well as this isn't good to say on a Lean Startups podcast, but you do have to. But you do kind of have to look at some of the vanity plays of investing in film. It's a lot more of an interesting thing to do with your money. I actually wrote a 7-part blog series on this that's available for free on my blog about comparing tech and film investments and why somebody would actually look at investing in film, and the biggest, as well as what needs to happen to make film a more sustainable asset class. So the biggest thing that needs to happen to make film a more sustainable asset class is that filmmakers need to learn more about business. Investors need to learn more about film investment, and the entire asset class needs to be better defined than it is right now. And that's a lot of what I do when I'm talking about filmmaking. So, yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like a huge challenge. And even me just saying that is a big understatement, I'm sure. You know, you've talked about the challenge of applying Lean Startup to the finance side. What about all the other elements? And I know I can't give you an exhaustive list, but when we think about marketing, when we think about screenwriting or scheduling or, you know, building your crew, finding your actors, etc., how are you able to apply some of the principles of lean startup, understanding that it's not a perfect process and it's going to be an iterative process? How have you seen those elements applied to the different aspects of making a film?
So on the script stage, there are a lot of different ways you can apply the principles of iteration, and every writer iterates. This is not something new. Any writer listening to this should know that a rewrite is an iteration, and you rewrite the script all the way up until you're on set. Sure. The script isn't completed until you have the final cut of the film, really. So I think the biggest thing is coping with uncertainty, because everything will change throughout making the film, and also thinking of film, while thinking of it as an uncertain process, thinking of it as a process that needs to be managed. A lot of filmmakers don't like to think of themselves as managers, especially directors or the more creative types, but really the entire job of directing is one of managing actors and managing crew to put out the vision that is your film or your product, because in this case they're synonymous. And I don't know how you'd apply lean startup to the casting process, although that is a very good question that I'm going to go off and research when we're done. But the most of what I do is casting. I do more in a traditional way. The filmmakers pick who they want. I help whittle down who they can actually get on their budget. And I go by a couple of metrics, including their IMDb star meter rating and their following on both Facebook and Twitter. And Instagram. Instagram is important.
Sure.
Sorry,
I apologize for interrupting, Ben, but it just led me to come up with an interesting thought. So when you look at their IMDb star rating, when you look at some of how they're being followed on Facebook, it gives you a sense of how, in air quotes, customers view that cast, view those actors. So you're getting that customer feedback to some extent. And it's important to think about the customer segment that you're trying to appeal to with the film that you're creating. But I just want to take a step back, because you also understandably talked about how scripts will iterate up to the very end and then even through the filming process. How does the voice of the customer come into that process? And I'm only, we've all seen those, on TMC videos where it's the producer or it's the finance person or the head of the studio or whatever who's saying, change it to my vision. But in a lean startup world, we're trying to bring in the customer into how we make changes.
That's a very good question, and part of where I think this applies is that the writer and the director and a lot of the creative team needs to be deeply involved in the communities that they're going to be trying to sell this film to. And that's the only way you can really get the customer feedback, because you can't exactly share a script too much for intellectual property concerns. And you've got to be very careful in how you manage test screenings. So but the biggest thing to get the consumer feedback in there is actually spending time, both in real life and online, to understand the customer segment you're going for. And I think a lot of that has to do with, especially when you're starting out and being an independent filmmaker, making films that appeal to a certain niche that you actually understand and you are a part of. And that's the biggest way to get the customer voices to actually live it. And this comes down to something that a lot of the filmmakers listening to this might just think of it as write what you know. But it's also part of the reason why there are so many movies on Hollywood, because people don't break out of their bubbles as much as they should. But if you want to make truly innovative content, you have to go to these underserved communities and these underrepresented communities. I think we're going to be seeing a lot of content, a lot of kind of new content coming to the surface now that we're really elevating the voices of Black and Latino filmmakers and women filmmakers and all of these other filmmakers who haven't had a chance to tell their story. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens as that trend grows and evolves, especially in the award circuits and these other places that are actually really making an effort to elevate the diversity of their voices.
That sounds very much like the kind of culture shift that lean startup as a methodology, as a mindset, as a way of driving different behaviors can contribute to. Is that something you see as well? Is it just something that's being market driven, or is it being driven by something else?
I think a lot of it is market driven, and I think that it's honestly been something that's been demanded in Hollywood for a much longer time. And right now, it's not something that happened overnight, and it is. I think that if we actually look at applying methodologies and frameworks like the Lean Startup to our processes, and actually look at questioning everything and never considering anything done, I think applying a lot of these Lean principles would help us adapt to change more. Because I think if we don't, we're not going to survive as an industry if we don't really look at this. I think a lot of people are kind of getting sick of the superhero movies, of the box office doesn't necessarily agree with me, but there are, I think a lot of people are looking more for independent content and more for original content as well, because it's really gone down in the last 20 years or so.
So what do you think it takes for filmmakers to be willing to take that kind of a risk, to have that independent voice, or to go down a pathway that is not as well trodden as the big Hollywood blockbusters or the formula films?
The right team is the biggest answer. And also an understanding that product or the film itself is only 50% of the battle. The other battle is business and marketing. And I actually break that out a bit more to say that about 20% is marketing, about 20% is business strategy, about 20% is talent and team, about 20% is production quality, and about 20% is script. And the team is broken out evenly on the two sides of that, because you need both a strong creative team and a strong business team. And I think that's about where I think filmmakers who understand that are going to have a much better chance at succeeding in this upheaval that's going on, because when you're first starting, the real challenge is rising above the white noise. And I know I've said that, but it is very true.
I can certainly understand that. I'm curious, because you've written about this, you've talked about your blogs. This is a different way of working and a different way of thinking. And other than seeking out advocates and explorers like yourself, how are young filmmakers learning about this? How are they developing the opportunity to adopt a mindset that focuses more on understanding the uncertainty in their work?
The sad answer is a lot of them aren't. And a lot of those are the ones that watch out. But the biggest problem with this is it's not the easiest thing to learn about. There are books that have been written about the business of the film industry. There are some blogs about the film industry that on the business side of it, my blog is among them. There are others, including filmmakingstuff.com and Film Specific, and some stuff on Indie Film Hustle, just so I'm not solely promoting my own work. But the biggest issue is that there's kind of a lack of desire in the film, on the part of the filmmakers, to learn more about this business and marketing. They just want to be creative and focus on the product. And that means that I think there kind of needs to be a new class of advocates that arise for those people who actually enjoy the producing side and enjoy the business side of film to actually help the creatives market their film and get it out there. And because I just don't think the filmmakers who spend 20 years getting to be a great cinematographer are going to want to learn how to market the film then. And that's understandable, but you have to have a team that has people who can do that.
So if you were going to give filmmakers, young filmmakers, people who have a strong creative vision, some advice, and I'm sure you're asked about this all the time, what would be the most compelling, well, let me come to it from a different way. What was the most compelling advice you ever got? Or the most impactful coaching you received? What would you want to pass on based on what you've learned?
Well, actually, when I started film school, I thought I wanted to be a writer-director, and that's changed a lot. I ended up becoming a producer by the end of my first semester in film school, and then after leaving film school, I respecialized to being a producer's rep and executive producer, which is more about the core business fundamentals of marketing, finance, and distribution. And that's a very rare thing to do. But the best advice I've ever gotten was just learn. Even if you don't want to be in the business side of the industry, that's fine, but you need to understand how it works. Otherwise some unscrupulous people might take advantage of you, and that happens way too often. And that's one of the reasons, and the biggest problem about learning the business side of the film industry is most film schools don't teach it, like, really. And that is one of the reasons that I continue to blog and put information out into the sphere, just so that there is more information that's available out there. Because again, I think the only way for the reputation of this asset class to change is if filmmakers better understand business. That's one of about 5 or 6 core things that need to change in order for film to become a more sustainable asset class.
Yeah, makes great sense. Well, Ben, I really appreciate your time today, and I'm sure those people that are listening to this now will also be grateful for the advice and really the love you show for the industry as well. I think that's definitely evident in your concern that people be as successful as they possibly can be. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.